Poor woman helps injured boy on the road, without knowing he was a millionaire's son. Grace Harper was walking along the dirt road when she heard a low moan coming from the roadside. Something inside her tightened even before she turned her head and saw the boy lying there. The boy was sitting in the dust, holding his right knee from which blood was flowing. His clothes were torn and dirty, and tears streamed down his face as he tried, unsuccessfully, to clean the wound with his own trembling hand. Grace dropped the shopping bag she was carrying and ran to him, her heart beating fast. She didn't think twice before kneeling beside the boy, her calloused hands already assessing the extent of the injury. The knee was badly hurt, with a deep cut that needed immediate attention. The boy looked at her with frightened eyes, as if expecting to be scolded. But upon meeting Grace's gentle gaze, he let out more tears. She realized this wasn't just crying from physical pain. There was something more there, a sadness that went beyond the visible injury. Without hesitation, Grace began tearing the hem of her own skirt, that fabric she had bought with such sacrifice months ago, but which now served a much more important purpose. The boy tried to protest, but she simply shook her head and continued her work, with firm but delicate movements. Grace's hands worked carefully as she cleaned the boy's wound with the water she had in her bottle. The boy flinched with every touch but didn't complain, just bit his lower lip trying to be brave. She realized he couldn't be more than 10 years old, maybe 11 at most, and that his clothes, although dirty and torn, were of good quality. This seemed strange to her. What was a boy like that doing alone on such a deserted road, so far from town? She tied the makeshift bandage firmly, making sure the bleeding stopped, and only then allowed herself to ask something. "What's your name, son?" The boy swallowed dryly before answering. "Ethan, my name is Ethan." "Ethan, what happened? Where are your parents?" The boy's face closed immediately, and fresh tears welled up in his eyes. Grace felt a tightening in her chest, recognizing that expression of pain that went beyond the physical. It was a pain she knew all too well, a pain that lived inside the chest and hurt in a way that no medicine could cure. She didn't press the question, just reached out and helped the boy stand up slowly. Ethan tested the weight on his injured leg and groaned softly, but managed to stand with her support. Grace looked around, assessing the situation. It was starting to get dark, and they were at least 3 miles from the nearest town. There were no houses around, just that dirt road surrounded by dense vegetation on both sides. "Can you walk if I support you?" she asked, already knowing it would be a difficult journey. Ethan nodded, but when he took the first step, he almost collapsed. The injured leg couldn't bear his weight. Grace made a quick decision. She was small and thin, the result of years of hard work and scarce food, but she had more strength than she appeared. Without saying anything, she bent down and helped the boy climb onto her back. Ethan hesitated, clearly uncomfortable being a burden, but the pain was too great to refuse. He clung to Grace's neck, trying to be as light as possible, while she picked up the shopping bag with one hand and began walking down the road. The first steps were the most difficult. Grace was already exhausted from a full day cleaning Mrs. Margaret's house, one of the few clients who still hired her regularly. Her back ached, her legs burned, and now she carried the added weight of a boy who, though small, was heavy enough to make each step a challenge. But she didn't complain. She didn't slow down. There was something about that boy that touched a dormant part of her heart, a maternal instinct she had tried to suppress for years, ever since she lost her own son. The memory came quickly and painfully, as it always did. Benjamin would be the same age as Ethan now, if he were still alive. Grace closed her eyes for a second, pushing the pain back into the depths of her soul where she always kept it locked away, and kept walking. "Why are you helping me?" Ethan's voice was low, almost a whisper in her ear. Grace took a while to respond, choosing her words carefully. "Because it's the right thing to do. Because I couldn't leave you here alone. Because everyone deserves help when they need it." "But you don't know me." "I don't need to know you need help." They continued in silence for a few more minutes. Grace felt the weight increasing with each step, her legs beginning to tremble slightly. The sun was setting quickly, tinting the sky orange and pink, and she knew they needed to reach town before it got completely dark. That road had no lighting, and walking in the dark would be dangerous. She quickened her pace, ignoring the pain that began to spread throughout her body. Ethan remained quiet, but she could feel tears falling on her shoulder, wetting her simple blouse. The boy was crying silently, and it broke Grace's heart in a way she didn't expect. "Do you want to tell me what happened?" she asked gently without pushing. Ethan sobbed before starting to speak, the words coming out haltingly and filled with emotion. I ran away from home. My dad, he doesn't care about me. He never did." Grace kept walking, letting the boy talk at his own pace. "He just works, always working. I try to talk to him, but he never has time. This morning I asked him to come to my soccer game at school. It's the championship final, and I'm the team captain. But he said he had an important meeting that he couldn't go. It's always like this, there's always something more important than me." Ethan's voice became even more choked up, and Grace felt her chest tighten with empathy. "I yelled at him, said I hated him, that he was never a real father. He didn't even care, you know? He just picked up his briefcase and left. My mom tried to calm me down, but she always defends him, says he works so hard for us that we should be grateful. But I don't want money or expensive things. I just wanted him to be there, you know, just once, just to see me play." Grace felt a tear roll down her own face. She knew that feeling of abandonment well, the feeling of not being important enough to someone. She had lived with it for years in her own marriage, before everything completely fell apart. "So, I ran out of the house. I didn't even think straight. I just wanted to get away. I grabbed my bike and started riding. I don't know how long I rode. I just know that when I stopped I was so far away I couldn't see the town anymore. And then the bike chain broke on a hill and I fell. The bike rolled down the road and disappeared into the bushes. I tried to go after it, but I slipped and hit my knee on a rock. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing." The boy sobbed louder before continuing. "I sat there I don't know for how long, waiting for someone to show up, but no one came by. I started to think I was going to stay there forever, that no one would come looking for me, that my dad wouldn't even notice I was gone." Grace stopped walking for a moment, turned her head to look at Ethan. "Your father must be looking for you right now, son. You can be sure of that. You don't know him. He probably didn't even notice I'm not home. No father is perfect, Ethan. Some take longer to learn how to show love, but that doesn't mean they don't love. Your father may not know how to show it, but I'm sure he does care about you." Ethan didn't respond, just buried his face in Grace's shoulder and continued crying softly. She started walking again, each step heavier than the last. The road seemed endless, winding through trees and thick brush. The sky was getting darker, and Grace knew she needed to hurry. She began to pray silently, asking for strength to make it to town. Her legs were trembling now, threatening to give way at any moment. Her back burned as if on fire. But she continued, one step after another, because stopping wasn't an option. After what felt like an eternity, Grace finally saw the first town lights in the distance. They were just small dots on the horizon, but they represented hope. She felt a momentary relief, but knew she still had a long way to go. Ethan had stopped crying but remained quiet, clinging to her neck. Grace could feel the boy's irregular breathing against her shoulder, and wondered if he had fallen asleep or was just too exhausted to speak. With every step she took, she thought of her own son, of how she would have done anything to save him, of how she would give anything to carry him like this one more time. The memory of Benjamin always came with a sharp pain in her chest. Her boy, who was only 8 years old when the accident happened. She was working that day, as she always was, cleaning a wealthy family's house in the city centre. Benjamin was under the care of the neighbour, Mrs. Constance, who looked after him when Grace needed to work. But that day, the boy had gone out to play in the street with other children and got distracted chasing a ball. The ball rolled into the busy street, and Benjamin ran after it without looking. The driver didn't have time to brake. Grace received the news hours later, when she finally managed to return home. She never forgave herself for not being there, for working when her son needed her most. That guilt ate away at her inside day after day, year after year. That's why she couldn't leave Ethan on that road. She couldn't abandon a child who needed help, even if it meant sacrificing her own strength. If she could save at least one child, maybe she could ease some of the weight she carried. Maybe she could feel that she still had some value, some purpose. Grace tightened her grip on Ethan's legs a little more and kept walking, each step a silent prayer, each breath a battle against the exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her. The town lights became clearer, and Grace began to recognize some buildings. She knew exactly where she needed to go, Dr. Mitchell's clinic located at the town entrance. It was the only place open at this hour where Ethan could receive proper care. The problem was, Grace didn't have much money. What she had earned that day would barely cover her own expenses for the week, but she didn't hesitate. That boy needed medical attention, and she would find a way to pay, even if it meant going hungry in the coming days. When she finally reached the clinic door, Grace was trembling so much she could barely open it. Her legs gave way the moment she crossed the entrance, and she would have fallen if the receptionist hadn't rushed to help her. With the young woman's help, she managed to get Ethan seated in a waiting room chair. The boy looked at her with gratitude and concern in his eyes, seeing the state she was in. Grace was covered in sweat, her face pale from exhaustion, and her hands visibly trembling. But she smiled at Ethan, wanting to reassure him. "Please, he needs a doctor," Grace said to the receptionist, her voice coming out hoarse. "His knee is badly hurt." The receptionist, a young woman in her early 20s named Emily, looked from Grace to Ethan, quickly assessing the situation. She already knew Grace by sight, aware that she was one of the local cleaning ladies, an honest woman who always struggled financially. Without asking questions, Emily motioned for them to wait while she went to call Dr. Mitchell. Grace sat down next to Ethan, finally allowing her body to rest. The pain was intense, especially in her back and legs, but she ignored it. Her concern was entirely focused on the boy beside her. "You're going to be fine, Ethan. The doctor will take care of your knee." "And you?" "You're not okay. It was my fault." "No, son, I'm fine, just a little tired. It'll pass." But the truth was that Grace was far from fine. Her whole body ached in a way she had never experienced before. She knew she had pushed herself too hard, that she would pay dearly for it in the coming days. But looking at Ethan, seeing the relief on his face at finally being in a safe place, she didn't regret it one bit. That boy was alive and would soon be cared for, and that was all that mattered. The office door opened, and Dr. Mitchell appeared, a middle-aged man with graying hair and thick glasses. He looked at Grace and Ethan, quickly understanding the situation. "Let's take a look at that knee, young man," he said in a gentle voice, signaling for Ethan to follow him. Ethan looked at Grace as if asking for permission, and she nodded encouragingly. The boy got up limping and went into the office, accompanied by the doctor. Grace stayed in the waiting room trying to catch her breath. Emily returned with a glass of water, which she gratefully accepted, drinking in long sips. The cool water went down her dry throat, bringing momentary relief. But worry was already beginning to grow in her mind. How would she pay for the treatment? Dr. Mitchell was known to be understanding, but he also had bills to pay. Grace began to mentally calculate how much she could offer. About 20 minutes later, the office door opened again. Ethan came out walking better, his knee now properly cleaned and bandaged. Dr. Mitchell followed right behind, carrying a clipboard with some notes. He looked at Grace with a serious expression. "The wound was deep, but I cleaned it well and put in a few stitches. He'll need to keep it bandaged for at least a week and take antibiotics to prevent infection. I'll write the prescription." Grace nodded, already calculating how much the medicine would cost. Dr. Mitchell continued, now in a softer, almost paternal tone. "Were you the one who found him and brought him here?" "Yes, sir. He was hurt on the road. I couldn't leave him there." The doctor studied Grace for a moment, noticing her obvious exhaustion, the worn and dirty clothes, the torn hem of her skirt that she had used to stop the boy's bleeding. He knew women like her, tireless workers who gave what little they had to help others. There was something noble about it, a genuine kindness that was becoming increasingly rare in the world. "Are you his mother?" asked the doctor, though he already knew the answer. "No, sir, I just found him on the road and wanted to help." Dr. Mitchell exchanged a meaningful look with Emily before turning back to Grace. "And his parents? Do they know where he is?" That's when Ethan spoke, his voice heavy with emotion. My father probably didn't even notice I ran away. He's never home, never has time for me." The doctor crouched in front of Ethan, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "I'm sure your father is worried about you, son. We need to call him. What's the number?" Ethan hesitated, but eventually gave a phone number. Emily went to the reception phone and dialed. Grace watched everything in silence, feeling a strange mix of relief and apprehension. She had done her part. She had brought the boy to safety, but something inside her didn't want to let him go. There was a connection she didn't fully understand, a protective feeling that went beyond simple compassion. Emily spoke on the phone for a few minutes, explaining the situation, and then hung up. "He's coming here now. He sounded very worried." Ethan said nothing, just lowered his head. Grace stood up slowly, her whole body protesting the movement. She needed to know how much the treatment would cost before the boy's father arrived. She didn't want him to think she was doing this expecting some reward. Dr. Mitchell seemed to read her thoughts. "Mrs. Grace, about the payment." "I'll pay, doctor. It might take a few days, but I'll pay every cent." The doctor smiled gently. "I know you will, but you don't need to worry about that now. You can pay me when you're able to." Grace felt her eyes burn with gratitude. Dr. Mitchell had always been a good man, and she would never forget that kindness. She nodded in thanks, not trusting her own voice to speak. Ethan approached her, and to her surprise, hugged her tightly. The boy's head reached her chest, and she could feel his tears wetting her blouse. Grace returned the hug, feeling her own heart tighten. It was so much like hugging Benjamin that she could hardly bear it, but she held firm, running her hand through the boy's hair in a comforting gesture. "Thank you," whispered Ethan. "Thank you for everything." "No need to thank me, son. I just did what anyone should do." "But you did more than that. You saved me." Grace didn't know how to respond. She just kept hugging the boy, feeling something heal inside her, a small part of the wound she carried in her heart. Perhaps helping that boy had also been a way of helping herself, of finding some purpose amid so much pain and loss. They remained like that for a few more minutes, until they heard the sound of a car braking sharply outside the clinic. The door swung open forcefully, and a man entered hurriedly. He was tall, wearing an expensive-looking dark grey suit, and his face was tense with worry. His eyes scanned the room until they found Ethan. "Ethan!" he exclaimed, running to the boy. Ethan separated from Grace and looked at his father, but didn't move to hug him. There was a clear distance between them, an invisible but palpable barrier. The man seemed to notice this, and for a moment his face showed pain, but it quickly returned to a more controlled expression. He knelt in front of Ethan, checking the bandaged knee with concern. "Are you okay? What happened? Why did you run away?" Ethan didn't answer, just looked away. The silence in the room was uncomfortable, charged with unspoken tensions. The man finally stood up and looked around, searching for answers. His eyes landed on Grace, and she saw his gaze quickly assess her simple appearance, her worn clothes, the torn hem of her skirt. There was judgment in that look, though he tried to hide it. Dr. Mitchell intervened, explaining the situation. "This woman found your son injured on the road and brought him here. She took care of him and made sure he received the necessary treatment." The man looked at Grace again, this time with a different expression. It was hard to tell if it was gratitude, surprise, or distrust. He extended his hand formally. "William Thompson, I'm Ethan's father. Thank you for helping my son." Grace shook his hand briefly, feeling uncomfortable under that penetrating gaze. "Grace Harper, I just did what was right. Even so, I'm grateful. How much do I owe for the medical care?" Grace opened her mouth to respond, but Dr. Mitchell was faster. "It's all settled, Mr. Thompson. Mrs. Grace has already taken care of everything." William looked from Grace to the doctor with evident disbelief. He knew just by Grace's appearance that she probably couldn't afford medical care, especially after using her own money and time to help a stranger. This bothered him in a way he couldn't explain. He was used to solving everything with money, paying his debts and keeping everything in order. The idea of being indebted to that humble woman made him uncomfortable. He took his wallet out of his pocket and grabbed some bills, extending them to Grace. "I want to reward you for what you did. Please accept." Grace looked at the money and then at William. There was pride in her eyes, a dignity that didn't match her precarious financial situation. She shook her head firmly. "No, sir, I don't want your money. I didn't do it expecting a reward." "But you spent your own money, your time. It's only fair that I reimburse you." "And I appreciate the offer, but I can't accept. I helped because it was the right thing to do, not because I wanted something in return." The refusal irritated William more than he expected. He was used to getting what he wanted, to solving problems with money. That woman's refusal made him feel powerless, as if she were rejecting his gesture of gratitude. But there was something in her eyes, a firmness that said insisting would be an insult. He put the money back in his wallet, clearly frustrated. Grace turned to Ethan, ignoring the tension between her and the boy's father. "Take care of yourself, Ethan, and remember what we talked about." Ethan nodded, his eyes still bright with held-back tears. Grace picked up her shopping bag, thanked Dr. Mitchell with a nod, and started walking toward the door. Every step was agony, her legs protesting against the movement, but she kept her posture straight. She didn't want to show weakness in front of that man, who already looked at her with so much judgment. When she was about to leave, she heard Ethan's voice behind her. "Wait!" She turned and saw the boy limping toward her, ignoring his father's protest. Ethan hugged her once more, tight and lingering. "I'll never forget you. Never." Grace felt the tears finally escape her eyes. She kissed the top of Ethan's head and whispered, "And I'll never forget you, my son." Then she left the clinic, before the tears turned into sobs. The night was cold and dark, and she had a long way to her humble home on the outskirts of the city. But as she walked, Grace didn't think about the pain or the tiredness. She thought only about that boy who, for a few hours, had filled a void in her heart. It had been painful, yes, because it reminded her of the son she had lost. But it had also been healing, in a way she couldn't fully explain. Maybe that was what she needed to start forgiving herself. Maybe saving a child was the first step to saving herself. William watched the woman leave, feeling strangely guilty. There was something wrong with the whole situation. A poor woman, clearly exhausted and struggling financially, had gone so far to help his son, while he, the father himself, hadn't even realized Ethan was missing until the school called hours later. The guilt weighed on his chest like a stone. He looked at his son, who stood still near the door, gazing where Grace had disappeared into the darkness. There was an expression on Ethan's face that William had never seen before, pure and genuine adoration. That unknown woman had managed, in just a few hours, to create a connection with his son that he hadn't been able to build in 10 years. "Let's go home, Ethan," William said, his voice coming out harsher than he intended. Ethan followed him silently to the car, an expensive black sedan parked in front of the clinic. The contrast between that car and the image of Grace walking alone in the darkness with her grocery bag was striking. William helped Ethan into the back seat and then sat behind the wheel. The drive back home was made in absolute silence. William tried several times to start a conversation, to ask his son what had happened, but the words died in his throat. He didn't know how to communicate with his own son, and that realization hurt more than he cared to admit. When they arrived at the mansion, an imposing structure with well-kept gardens and automatic gates, they found Victoria, William's wife and Ethan's mother, waiting in the living room. She rushed to Ethan as soon as they entered, checking if he was okay, asking 1,000 questions at once. Ethan answered in monosyllables, clearly exhausted. Victoria finally stopped talking and looked at her husband, expecting explanations. William briefly recounted what had happened. A woman had found Ethan on the road and taken him to the clinic. He mentioned that he had offered money as a thank you, but she had refused. "She refused money?" Victoria asked, incredulous. "Who refuses money?" "Someone who has dignity," Ethan suddenly replied, his voice filled with a conviction that surprised both parents. Victoria blinked, taken aback by her son's response. She was about to scold him for his tone when William raised his hand, asking her to stop. There was truth in Ethan's words, a truth they needed to hear, even if it hurt. The boy turned to go up the stairs toward his room, but stopped halfway and looked back. That woman treated me better in 2 hours than you have treated me in my entire life, and she didn't even know me." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Ethan climbed the rest of the stairs without waiting for a response, leaving his parents frozen in the living room. Victoria looked at William with wide eyes, clearly shocked. She opened her mouth to say something, but nothing came out. William felt a lump in his throat. He wanted to deny it, to say that Ethan was being dramatic, that he was hurt and tired and didn't know what he was saying. But deep down he knew his son was right. They had failed as parents. They had given everything materially, but nothing emotionally, and now they were paying the price. William poured himself a glass of whiskey, something he rarely did, and sat on the leather sofa in the living room. Victoria joined him, but neither of them spoke. They stayed there in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, confronted with truths they had ignored for too long. The mansion around them was full of expensive objects, luxury and comfort, but that night it seemed empty and cold. It wasn't a home. It was just a big house where 3 people lived, but didn't live together. Meanwhile, Grace finally arrived at her small house on the outskirts of the city. It was a simple 2-room structure, with walls painted white that had faded over time and a small backyard where she tried to grow some herbs. The house wasn't much, but it was hers, bought with great sacrifice over the years. She stumbled inside, barely able to stand. She left the grocery bag on the small kitchen table and went straight to the bedroom, collapsing on the bed without even taking off her clothes. Her entire body screamed with pain, especially her back and legs. She knew she would wake up with terrible aches the next day, but she didn't regret it. Before falling asleep, Grace looked at the framed photograph on the nightstand. It was a picture of Benjamin, her son, smiling at the camera with his 2 front teeth missing. She gently touched the photo with her fingers. "Today I helped a boy, Benjamin, a boy who reminded me so much of you. I hope that wherever you are, you're proud of your mother." A tear rolled down Grace's face before she finally closed her eyes and let sleep take her. That night, for the first time in years, she didn't dream about the accident that took her son. Instead, she dreamed of a boy with dark hair and gentle eyes smiling at her and calling her his second mother. It was a sweet, comforting dream, and when she woke up the next morning, despite all the pain, Grace felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope that there was still kindness in the world. Hope that she could still make a difference. Hope that maybe she could move forward without feeling so guilty about the past. The following days were difficult for Grace. The body aches persisted, making every movement an agony. She had to miss 2 jobs because she could barely walk, and that meant less money in an already precarious financial situation. But she didn't regret it. Whenever the pain became too strong, she thought of Ethan, of his relieved smile when they finally reached the clinic, and that made her feel it had been worth it. What Grace didn't know was that Ethan also thought of her constantly. The boy was different since that night, quieter, more thoughtful. He didn't talk much with his parents, but when he did, he mentioned Grace. How kind she had been, how she had sacrificed herself for him, how she was different from anyone he had ever met. William listened to these mentions with a mix of gratitude and discomfort. He was grateful that this woman had saved his son, but the discomfort came from the fact that he couldn't repay her. She had refused money, so how could he pay that debt? And it was a debt no matter how much she said she didn't want anything in return. She had saved what he held most precious in the world, and he needed to find a way to thank her. During the days that followed, William thought of several possibilities. He considered sending gifts anonymously, but that seemed invasive. He thought about offering a better job, but didn't know if she would be offended. In the end, he did nothing, and that tormented him. Victoria was also affected by the situation, but in a different way. She felt threatened by Grace's figure, by the way Ethan spoke of that woman with such affection. As a mother, Victoria felt that she should be the one receiving that adoration, that unconditional love. But she knew deep in her heart that she had failed. She was so busy with social commitments, with keeping up appearances, with going to the right places and meeting the right people, that she had forgotten to be a real mother. Ethan was well-dressed, well-fed, had everything he needed materially, but emotionally, He was empty. And now that unknown woman had shown her son what it was like to receive genuine love, and that hurt Victoria in a way she didn't know how to process. Ethan, in turn, couldn't stop thinking about Grace. He wondered how she was, if her knee had gotten hurt from carrying him on her back for so long, if she had made it home safely. He wanted to see her again, thank her properly, but didn't know how to find her. His father had mentioned that she was a house cleaner, that she worked cleaning houses, but didn't know much more than that. Ethan thought about asking his father to look for her, but something held him back. He had the feeling that his parents wouldn't approve, especially his mother, who had made some unpleasant comments about that woman since that day. 1 week after the incident, Ethan was returning from school when he saw Grace walking on the other side of the street. He recognized her immediately, his heart racing with joy. Without thinking twice, he dashed across the street, ignoring the protesting shouts of the private driver who was picking him up. Grace was walking slowly, carrying a heavy bag, when she felt someone hug her from behind. She was startled, dropping the bag and turning quickly, only to find Ethan's smiling face. The fright turned into joy, and she returned the hug with enthusiasm. "Ethan, how are you? Is your knee better?" "It's much better. Look, I can walk without limping almost at all. But what about you? Your back, your legs? I was so worried. You were so tired that day." Grace felt her heart warm with the genuine concern in the boy's voice. "I'm fine, son. I was sore for a few days, but it's gone now." She was lying. The pains still lingered, especially when the weather changed. But she didn't want Ethan to feel guilty. The boy seemed relieved by the answer, but then his expression grew more serious. "I thought about you every day. I wanted to thank you again, but I didn't know how to find you." "You don't need to thank me, Ethan. I already said that, but I want to. You did so much for me, though. No one has ever done anything like that for me." Grace bent down to be at eye level with Ethan, placing her hands on his shoulders. "Ethan, what I did because you needed help. Any decent person would have done the same." "That's not true. You know it's not. Most people would have just passed by, but you stopped, you cared." Grace didn't know what to say. She just hugged the boy again, feeling that special connection that had formed between them that night on the road. It was at that moment that they heard a voice behind them. It was Ethan's private driver, who had parked the car and come looking for the boy. He seemed confused to see Ethan hugging this unknown woman. Grace quickly stood up, releasing Ethan and taking a step back. She suddenly felt uncomfortable, as if she were doing something wrong. The driver approached, looking from Grace to Ethan with suspicion. "Ethan, your father is waiting for you at home. We need to go." Ethan seemed to want to protest, but then he just nodded. He turned to Grace one last time. "Can I see you again?" Grace hesitated. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to be able to see that boy again, but something made her hesitate. There were social lines that shouldn't be crossed, class differences that were real and palpable. She was just a poor housekeeper, and Ethan was the son of a wealthy family. Allowing that friendship to continue could bring problems for both of them. But looking at the hope in Ethan's eyes, she couldn't say no. "Of course, son. If our paths cross again, I'll be happy to see you." It wasn't exactly a promise, but it was enough to make Ethan smile. He waved to her as he was led back to the car by the driver. Grace watched the car drive away, feeling a mix of happiness at having seen Ethan again and sadness at knowing that this probably wouldn't be a friendship that could flourish. The world didn't work that way. People like her and people like Ethan's family lived in different universes, and rarely did those universes meet in any meaningful way. She picked up her shopping bag and continued walking toward the market, trying not to think too much about it. But Ethan wasn't willing to let that encounter be the last. That evening during dinner, he casually mentioned that he had run into Grace on the street. Victoria's reaction was immediate and negative. She dropped her fork onto her plate with a loud clatter, her eyes widening. "You what? What do you mean you saw that woman?" Ethan noticed the disapproval in his mother's voice and immediately became defensive. "I saw her on the street and went to talk to her. What's the problem? The problem, Ethan, is that you don't know this woman. She could be anyone. She might have ulterior motives. Ulterior motives? She saved me. She carried me for miles when I was exhausted. And that's exactly what worries me, Victoria continued, her voice growing louder. She did all that and refused money. That's not normal. She clearly wants something. You don't know her. You don't know anything about her. And you do? You barely know her, Ethan. She might be trying to take advantage of you, of us. William, who had remained silent until then, finally intervened. Victoria, I think you're overreacting. The woman helped our son. There's no reason to suspect her. No reason. William, an unknown woman approaches our son, does him a huge favor, refuses a reward, and now he's running into her on the street. Don't you see how strange that is? Ethan stood up from the table, tears streaming down his face. You don't understand anything. She doesn't want anything from me. She was just kind, something you've never been. Ethan, come back here right now, Victoria shouted, but the boy was already running up the stairs. The sound of his bedroom door slamming echoed through the mansion. Victoria covered her face with her hands, taking deep breaths to calm herself. William looked at his wife, seeing in her something he had never noticed before: fear. Victoria was afraid of losing her son to a stranger, afraid of being replaced in Ethan's heart, and that fear was manifesting as distrust and hostility. William stood up and placed a hand on his wife's shoulder. Maybe we should meet this woman, understand who she is, what she wants, if she wants anything at all. Victoria looked at her husband, still visibly upset. Do you think I'm wrong? I think you're afraid, and I understand. But accusing this woman without knowing her isn't fair. She saved our son, Victoria. That has to count for something. Victoria sighed, knowing her husband was right, but not wanting to admit it. All right, but I want to meet her. I want to look into her eyes and see who she really is. William nodded in agreement. He too felt he needed to see Grace again, but for different reasons. He wanted to understand what kind of person would sacrifice so much for a stranger without wanting anything in return. He wanted to understand this kindness that seemed so genuine, so different from everything he knew. In the world William lived in, every favor had a price, every kindness had a hidden motivation, but Grace seemed to defy that logic, and that intrigued him deeply. In the following days, William discreetly investigated Grace. It wasn't hard to find out where she lived and where she worked. She was known in the community as a hard-working and honest woman, always willing to help neighbors in need, despite her own difficulties. People spoke well of her with respect and affection. There was nothing suspicious in her past, no indication of ulterior motives. William shared his findings with Victoria, hoping it would calm her. But instead, his wife seemed to become even more troubled. If Grace was really as good as people said, that meant she was an even greater threat. How could Victoria compete with someone genuinely kind when she herself knew she had failed as a mother? Victoria's insecurity only grew, and with it grew her determination to keep Grace away from her family. She began making subtle comments, planting seeds of doubt about Grace whenever she could. She would tell William that people like her always ended up wanting something, that it was only a matter of time. She would tell Ethan that he shouldn't get attached to strangers, that he had a family who loved him. But her words fell on deaf ears because Ethan had already decided that Grace was important to him, and nothing his mother said would change that. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. Ethan began visiting Grace in secret. He found out where she lived through the driver, who casually mentioned having seen that woman several times in the neighborhood on the outskirts. The following Saturday, when his parents thought he was at tennis class, Ethan took a bus alone for the first time in his life and went to Grace's neighborhood. It was a journey that opened his eyes. The boy had never seen real poverty. He lived in a bubble of luxury and comfort, where everyone had expensive cars and big houses. But there, on the narrow and potholed streets of the outskirts, he saw a completely different world. He saw small and simple houses, children playing barefoot in the street, adults working hard just to survive. It was a shock to his system, but it was also educational in a way that no expensive school could ever teach. When Ethan finally found Grace's house, he hesitated at the door. The house was so small, so humble compared to the mansion where he lived. For a moment he felt ashamed for having so much when Grace had so little. But then he knocked on the door, and when Grace opened it and saw who was there, her face lit up with such a genuine smile that all of Ethan's doubts disappeared. She invited him in, clearly surprised but happy with the visit. The inside of the house was simple but clean, every object in its place, everything cared for with affection, even though it was old and worn. Ethan sat on the small living room sofa while Grace made orange juice in the tiny kitchen. "Ethan, do your parents know you're here?" she asked when she returned with the glasses of juice. The boy hesitated before answering. "No, they don't know." Grace sighed, placing the glass on the coffee table. "You shouldn't be here, son. Your parents will be worried. They won't even notice I'm gone. They think I'm at tennis class. Even so, it's not right for you to lie to them." Ethan looked at the floor, feeling guilty but at the same time defiant. "I just wanted to see you. I just wanted to talk to someone who really cares about me." Grace felt her heart tighten. She sat next to Ethan and took his hand. "Your parents care about you, Ethan. Sometimes people just don't know how to show it. You always defend them. Why? Because they're your parents, and because no matter how imperfect they are, they love you. I can see that. You barely know them. That's true. But I know a mother's and father's love, and I can assure you they love you even if they don't know how to show it." Ethan was quiet for a moment before asking something that had been on his mind since he entered the house. "Do you have children?" The question caught Grace off guard. She felt tears welling up, but blinked quickly to hold them back. "I had a son. His name was Benjamin." "What happened to him?" Grace took a deep breath, preparing to share something she rarely talked about. "He passed away 5 years ago. He was 8 years old when it happened." Ethan's eyes widened, horrified. "I'm sorry, I didn't know. I shouldn't have asked." "It's okay, son. You didn't know, and actually, it does good to talk about him sometimes." "What was he like?" Grace smiled, a mixture of sadness and affection. "He was a lot like you. Dark hair, bright eyes, always curious about everything. He loved playing soccer, just like you, and he had a huge heart, always bringing stray animals home, wanting to take care of them. He sounds like he was amazing." He was. He was my whole world." "And his father?" Grace's face closed off a little. "My husband left me shortly after the accident. He blamed me for what happened to Benjamin, and I blamed myself too. I still do." "It wasn't your fault," Ethan said with conviction. "I should have been there. I was working when it happened. If I had stayed home, if I had been there, you can't know what would have happened. You were working to give him a better life. That's not your fault." Grace looked at Ethan with surprise. His words, coming from a child, held a wisdom she hadn't expected, and somehow those words brought a comfort that years of therapy hadn't managed to bring. She hugged Ethan, letting a few tears finally fall. Ethan returned the hug, feeling closer to Grace than he had ever felt to his own mother. They stayed like that for a long moment, two wounded hearts finding comfort in each other. When they finally separated, Grace wiped her tears and smiled. "You're very smart for your age, you know." "My teacher always says that, but I think I just pay attention to things." "That's a valuable skill, Ethan. Many adults never learn that." They talked for another hour about various subjects. Ethan told her about school, about his friends, about his frustrations with his parents. Grace listened to everything attentively, asking questions, offering gentle advice, never judging. It was the first time Ethan felt he had someone who really listened to him, who cared about what he had to say. When it was time to leave, Ethan didn't want to go, but Grace insisted, saying he needed to get back before his parents found out. She walked Ethan to the bus stop, waited with him until the bus arrived, and only went back home after seeing him leave. As she walked back, Grace thought about the conversation they had. Talking about Benjamin had been painful, but also cathartic, and having Ethan there in her home had filled a void she didn't even know she still had. But the peace wouldn't last long. The next day, a Sunday, Grace was in her small backyard garden when she heard loud knocks on the door. She wiped her hands on her skirt and went to answer, surprised by the visit. When she opened the door, she found Victoria standing there, dressed elegantly even though it was Sunday, her face a mask of controlled coldness. Grace instantly knew there was trouble. Victoria entered without being invited, her eyes scanning the small house with a look that mixed disdain and discomfort. Grace closed the door and waited, her heart beating fast. "Are you Grace Harper?" Victoria asked, although she already knew the answer. "Yes, and you must be Ethan's mother." "I am, Victoria Thompson. I came here to have a frank conversation with you." Grace gestured to the sofa, inviting Victoria to sit, but the woman remained standing, clearly not wanting to stay in that house longer than necessary. Grace also remained standing, maintaining her dignity even though she felt intimidated by the imposing presence of that woman. "I know my son came here yesterday," Victoria began, her voice sharp. "He confessed when confronted. He came of his own will. I didn't invite him. But you received him. You let him in." "What was I supposed to do? Send him away? He's a child who came to visit me. I did nothing wrong." "You did nothing wrong?" Victoria took a step forward, her voice rising. "You are infiltrating my son's life, creating an emotional dependency in him. This is manipulation." Grace felt her anger rise, but kept her voice calm. "I'm not infiltrating anything. I helped your son when he needed it, and now he wants to be my friend. There's nothing wrong with that." "There's everything wrong with that. You're a stranger. You have no right to get close to my son." "And do you have the right to emotionally neglect him? Do you have the right to make him feel invisible in his own home?" The words came out before Grace could stop them. She saw Victoria's face turn red with anger, but she also saw something else there: pain. Those words had hit an open wound. Victoria took another step toward Grace, her finger pointed at her. "You know nothing about me or how I raise my son. Don't you dare judge me." "I'm not judging. I'm just telling the truth that Ethan told me. He's suffering and you don't even notice. And you think you can help him. You who have nothing, who live in this miserable house, who works cleaning other people's homes. What exactly can you offer my son?" The words were spoken with so much venom that Grace had to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. But she kept her head high, her voice firm when she replied, "I can offer what he needs most and what you don't give him: genuine attention, true affection, and the certainty that he matters." Victoria was speechless for a moment, clearly not expecting that humble woman to have the courage to confront her. She opened and closed her mouth a few times before finally finding the words. "I want you to stay away from my son. Don't receive him anymore. Don't talk to him anymore. Keep your distance. If I find out that you're continuing this inappropriate relationship, I will take legal measures." "Legal measures? Why?" "For being kind to a child. For taking advantage of a vulnerable child. For manipulation. I'll find a way to make this look wrong. Don't worry." Grace felt a chill in her stomach. She knew that people with money and power like Victoria could make someone like her's life a living hell if they wanted to. She didn't have the resources to defend herself legally. One word from Victoria could destroy her reputation, make her lose her jobs, make her life even more difficult than it already was. But even with all that fear, Grace couldn't simply promise something she knew was wrong. "If Ethan comes looking for me again, I won't send him away. I won't treat a child with cruelty just because you're afraid of losing his love." "I'm not afraid of anything." "Yes, you are. You're afraid that your son prefers a poor stranger to his own mother. And you know why? Because deep down, you know you failed. You know you didn't give him what he needed. And instead of trying to fix that, you're here threatening me." Victoria was trembling with anger now, her face completely red. For a moment, Grace thought she was going to hit her, but then Victoria just turned and walked to the door, opening it forcefully. "I warned you. If you don't stay away, you'll regret it." And then she left, slamming the door behind her so hard that it made the walls of the small house shake. Grace stood still in the middle of the room, trembling, tears finally falling freely down her face. She wasn't a person who liked conflicts, who looked for fights, but she also couldn't let a child suffer just because his mother was too proud to admit her mistakes. Grace sat on the couch, burying her face in her hands, and cried. She cried for the impossible situation she was in. She cried for Ethan, who was caught in the middle of it. She cried for Benjamin, whom she still missed every day. In the following days, things started to get worse for Grace in ways she didn't expect. First, 2 of her clients cancelled her services without giving clear explanations. Then she went to the local market and noticed people were looking at her strangely, whispering as she passed by. On the 3rd day, Mrs. Margaret, her oldest and most reliable client, called her in for an uncomfortable conversation. The elderly lady seemed genuinely distressed when she told Grace that she could no longer keep her services. When Grace asked why, Mrs. Margaret hesitated before admitting she had received a call from a woman saying terrible things about Grace, things about her trying to take advantage of wealthy families, about her being inappropriate with children. Grace left Mrs. Margaret's house in shock. Victoria was indeed making good on her threat. She was spreading lies about her, destroying her reputation and her ability to make a living. It was pure cruelty, motivated by jealousy and insecurity. Grace knew she should be afraid, should be worried about how she would pay her bills in the coming months. But what she felt most was sadness. Sadness for Ethan, who was caught in the middle of a war he hadn't started. Sadness for Victoria, who was so lost in her own insecurities that she was harming an innocent person. And sadness for herself, for being punished for doing the right thing. When Grace arrived home that afternoon, she found Ethan waiting for her at the door. His eyes were red and swollen from crying. As soon as he saw Grace, he ran to her and hugged her tightly. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," he repeated between sobs. "I told my mum that I came here and now she's doing horrible things." Grace stroked Ethan's hair, trying to comfort him. "It's not your fault, son. You didn't do anything wrong." "But she's spreading lies about you. She's making you lose your job. It's all my fault for coming here." "No, Ethan, it's not your fault. Your mother is doing these things by her own choice, not because of you. She's scared and reacting in the worst possible way. But that's not your responsibility." Ethan pulled back a little to look at Grace. "What are you going to do?" Grace sighed, trying to appear stronger than she felt. "I'll find other jobs. I'll be fine. Don't worry about me." "But what if she keeps doing this? What if she makes sure no one hires you?" "Then I'll find other ways to survive. I always do. It's not fair. You were just kind to me and you're being punished for it." "Life isn't always fair, Ethan. But that doesn't mean we should stop doing what's right." They went into the house and Grace made tea for both of them. They sat at the kitchen table and Ethan told her what it had been like at home since his mother found out about his visit. There had been a huge fight between his parents. His father didn't seem to fully agree with his mother's actions, but he wasn't stopping her either. Ethan felt trapped in the middle, guilty about the whole situation. Grace listened to everything patiently, offering words of comfort where she could. But she knew the situation was becoming unsustainable. She couldn't keep seeing Ethan without severe consequences, but she also didn't want to abandon the boy when he clearly needed her. The solution came in a way neither of them expected. William, who had been watching the situation unfold with growing discomfort, finally decided to act. He didn't agree with what Victoria was doing, but he had been too cowardly to confront her. Until now. That evening, when Victoria was preparing to make more calls to spread rumors about Grace, William took the phone from her hand. Victoria looked at him with surprise and indignation. "What do you think you're doing?" "Stopping you from destroying an innocent woman's life." "Innocent? William, she's manipulating our son." "She's not manipulating anyone. She was kind to Ethan when he needed it, and now he cares about her. That's not manipulation, Victoria. That's just basic humanity. Don't you see the danger in this? A stranger getting close to him? The only danger I see is what you're causing. You're spreading lies about a woman who saved our son. You're being cruel and vindictive, and all for what? Because you're jealous?" Victoria recoiled as if she had been slapped. "Jealous? I'm not jealous." "Yes, you are. You're jealous because Ethan likes her, because he speaks of her fondly, because she achieved in a few hours what you couldn't in 10 years, making our son feel loved." William's words were harsh, harsher than he intended, but they were true. Victoria stood there, trembling, tears starting to fall from her eyes. William immediately regretted the tone, but not the words. He approached his wife, placing his hands on her shoulders. "Victoria, I know you love Ethan. I know you're doing this because you're afraid of losing him. But look at what you're doing. You're hurting an innocent woman. You're hurting our son by putting him in this position, and you're hurting yourself by acting this way." Victoria broke down in tears, sinking into the couch. William sat beside her, pulling her into an awkward hug. They weren't an affectionate couple, rarely touching beyond what was necessary, but in that moment, they both needed that contact. Victoria cried on her husband's shoulder, years of frustration, insecurity, and failures manifesting in those tears. William let her cry, not trying to console with empty words, just being present. When she finally calmed down, he spoke gently. "We've failed as parents, Victoria. You, me, both of us. We've been so busy with work, with social commitments, with keeping up appearances, that we forgot to be real parents. And Ethan is suffering because of it." Victoria nodded, unable to speak yet, the tears continuing to fall silently. "But it's not too late for us to change. We can start doing better. We can learn to be the parents Ethan needs." "But what about that woman?" Victoria finally managed to say. "Grace, her name is Grace, and she's not our enemy. She's not trying to replace us. She simply cares about our son." "So what do we do?" William thought for a moment before answering. "First, you're going to stop spreading lies about her. You'll call everyone you talk to and retract everything you said. You'll apologize." Victoria seemed to want to protest, but then just nodded, accepting that it was necessary. "And then?" she asked. "Then we'll get to know her for real. We'll understand who she is and why Ethan cares so much about her. And then we'll see what happens." Victoria wasn't sure if she could do all that. The idea of apologizing, of admitting she was wrong, went against everything she was. But looking at her husband, seeing the seriousness in his eyes, she knew she had no choice. If she wanted to save her family, she would have to swallow her pride and do what was right. In the following days, Victoria began to undo the damage she had caused. She called every person she had spoken ill of Grace to, retracted her words, made up an excuse about misunderstandings and wrong information. It was humiliating, each call a wound to her pride, but she persisted. Some people accepted her retractions easily, others were more skeptical, but eventually the truth began to spread. Grace wasn't who Victoria had painted her to be. Grace began to notice the change when Mrs. Margaret called, apologizing and saying she wanted to hire her again. Then another client called, and then another. Grace was confused but grateful, without fully understanding what had changed. It was Ethan who eventually told her about his father's intervention, about how William had confronted Victoria and forced her to correct her mistakes. Grace was surprised, never imagining that William would do something like that. She had misjudged the man, thinking he was as cold as he appeared. But perhaps just like Victoria, he simply didn't know how to properly show his feelings. A week after Victoria began her apologies, Grace received an unexpected visit. It was William, alone this time, standing at the door with a humble expression that contrasted with the confident posture she had seen at the clinic. She invited him in, nervous about what that visit meant. He sat on the same sofa where Victoria had sat weeks before, but his presence was completely different. Where Victoria had brought hostility, William brought peace. Grace served coffee for both of them, her hands trembling slightly as she held the cup. William took a sip before starting to speak. "I came to apologize for what my wife did. Her behavior was unacceptable and caused damage that has no excuse." Grace didn't know what to say at first, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. I appreciate the apology, and I thank you for making her fix things. It shouldn't have had to come to that. I should have intervened earlier. I was a coward." "You're here now. That counts for something." William nodded, appreciating her kindness even after everything. "I also came here to get to know you, to understand who the woman is who saved my son and who now means so much to him." Grace shifted on the sofa, uncomfortable with the attention. "There's not much to know. I'm just a cleaning lady, an ordinary woman trying to get by. Ordinary women don't carry unknown children for miles when they're exhausted. Ordinary women don't refuse money when they clearly need it. Ordinary women don't care so much about a boy they barely know. I just did what any decent person would do, But you and I know most people wouldn't have. Most would have passed right by, or maybe called someone, but they wouldn't have sacrificed themselves the way you did." Grace looked away, uncomfortable with the praise. "I had my reasons. Ethan told me about your son, about Benjamin. I'm sorry for your loss." Tears welled up in Grace's eyes, as always happened when someone mentioned Benjamin. "Thank you. It's still hard, even after 5 years." "I imagine it is. I can't even imagine losing Ethan. The thought terrifies me." "Then you understand why I couldn't leave him on that road. He needed help and I could help. It was that simple." William was quiet for a moment, watching Grace. She was so different from the people in his social circle. There was no falseness in her, no hidden agenda, just a genuine kindness he rarely saw. He understood in that moment why Ethan had become so attached to her. It was because she was real, authentic, something missing from the boy's life. William leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Grace, I'd like to make a proposal. And before you automatically refuse, please hear me out." Grace nodded cautiously, already expecting him to offer money again. "Ethan clearly cares a great deal about you, and after meeting you I understand why. You're genuinely good with him and he needs that in his life." William paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'd like to ask you to become part of his life, officially. Not as a stranger he visits in secret, but as someone who's present. I know you work a lot, but perhaps you could find time to see him regularly. Having dinner with the family a few times a week, perhaps. Being there for him when he needs to talk." Grace was shocked by the proposal. "Mr. Thompson, I'm not sure if that's a good idea. Your wife." "My wife agreed to this. We talked at length about the situation, and she understands that Ethan needs you in his life. She's still dealing with her own insecurities, but she's willing to try." "But what exactly would my role be? I'm not family." "You would be Ethan's friend. You would be a supportive figure, someone he can trust and rely on." Grace hesitated. The proposal was tempting, but also frightening. Being part of Ethan's life would mean getting more deeply involved with that family. It would mean opening her heart more than she ever had, and that made her vulnerable. What would happen if she got too attached and then was pushed away? What would happen if Victoria changed her mind? But then she thought of Ethan, how he had brightened her life since that day on the road, how he made her feel like she still had a purpose. And she knew that, despite the risks, she couldn't refuse. "All right," she said finally. "I accept. But on one condition." "What?" "That this is done for the right reasons, not out of guilt, not because you feel indebted to me, only because it's what's best for Ethan." William smiled, a genuine smile that completely transformed his face. "I completely agree. And thank you, Grace. You don't know how much this means." When William left, Grace sat on her couch for a long time, processing what had happened. Her life was about to change in ways she had never imagined. She would be part of a family again, even if in a non-traditional way, and although there was fear about the future, there was also hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, she could make a difference in Ethan's life, and by making a difference in his life, perhaps she could also heal her own wounds a little more. That night, for the first time since Victoria's hostile visit, Grace slept peacefully. The first dinners at the Thompson mansion were uncomfortable, to say the least. Grace felt completely out of place in that luxurious environment, with silverware she didn't know how to use properly, and conversations about things she didn't understand. Victoria was polite but distant, clearly still dealing with her own issues. William made an effort to include Grace in the conversations, but even so, there was a palpable tension. The only one who seemed genuinely happy was Ethan, who smiled more than his parents had seen him smile in years. During the first dinner, there was a particularly awkward moment when Grace used the wrong fork for the salad. She realized her mistake when she saw Victoria looking disapprovingly. Grace felt her face flush with embarrassment, but then Ethan cheerfully commented that he never knew which fork to use either, and found it all very complicated. The tension eased a bit, and even Victoria had to suppress a small smile. As the weeks passed, the dinners became less uncomfortable. Grace began to relax, worrying less about making etiquette mistakes and focusing more on simply being present. She told stories about her work, her neighbors, bringing a perspective on life that the family had never experienced. William found himself genuinely interested in her stories, asking questions about what her life was like, about the challenges she faced. Victoria remained more reserved, but occasionally made comments that showed she was paying attention too. Ethan was the glue that held everything together, his evident happiness being the constant reminder of why everyone was doing this. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were moments of tension, especially when the differences between Grace's world and the Thompsons became too evident. Once during dinner, Victoria casually mentioned how much she had spent on a new pair of shoes. The amount was more than Grace earned in an entire month of work. Grace said nothing, but William noticed her discomfort and quickly changed the subject. After that day, he had a private conversation with Victoria about being more mindful. Victoria, to her credit, tried. She began to think more before speaking, to avoid topics that might highlight the economic disparity between them. It was a small effort, but it meant a lot. One of the biggest challenges came from an unexpected direction: Victoria's social circle. When her friends found out that a housekeeper was regularly dining at her home, their reactions were of shock and even disgust. Some made nasty comments, others simply drifted away. Victoria quickly discovered who her true friends were. Most weren't. That hurt initially, but it was also liberating in a strange way. Victoria realized she had spent years maintaining superficial friendships with people who only cared about status and appearances, people who never really cared about her as a person. It was a hard but necessary lesson. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. 3 months after the regular dinners began, something happened that changed everything again. Ethan had improved significantly. He was happier, more confident. His grades at school had gone up. His relationship with his parents had also improved, with William making a genuine effort to be more present and Victoria working on her own issues through therapy. Things were finally going well. And then Grace fainted during one of the dinners. She was serving herself salad when she suddenly felt everything spinning. The last thing she remembered was Ethan screaming her name before everything went black. When she woke up, she was in the hospital, with a doctor explaining that she was severely anemic and malnourished. She had been working too much and eating too little, her body finally giving in under the pressure. William was in the room when she woke up, his face showing genuine concern. He explained that Ethan was at home with Victoria, who wanted to come, but someone needed to stay with the boy. The doctor had said Grace would need a few weeks of rest and proper nutrition to recover. William immediately said he would pay all the medical expenses, and this time Grace was too weak to refuse. She knew she couldn't afford it on her own. But what William said next surprised her even more. He said she couldn't go home alone in her condition, that she needed care and good food. And then he made an offer that left Grace speechless. She would stay at their mansion during her recovery. Grace tried to refuse immediately. It would be too much, it would cross boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. But William insisted, and when Victoria arrived at the hospital a few hours later, she also insisted. To Grace's surprise, Victoria seemed genuinely worried, her defensive barriers temporarily lowered by the situation. Victoria took Grace's hand, something she had never done before, and asked almost pleadingly for her to accept. She said it was the least they could do for everything she had done for Ethan. She said Ethan was terrified and would only calm down knowing Grace was being well cared for. And then, more quietly, almost embarrassed, Victoria admitted that she was worried too. That at some point during those months she had started to care about Grace, even while trying not to. That confession left Grace so surprised that she ended up agreeing to the offer. When she was discharged 2 days later, she went straight to the Thompsons' mansion. She was given one of the guest rooms, a space larger than her entire house, with a king-size bed that seemed absurdly luxurious. Ethan spent every free minute by her side, talking, reading to her, just being present. Victoria supervised her meals, making sure she ate everything, that she was properly nourished. William checked in with her regularly, ensuring she had everything she needed. It was strange to be cared for like that after so many years of taking care of others, but it was also comforting in a way Grace hadn't expected. During her stay at the mansion, something changed in the dynamic between Grace and Victoria. Maybe it was the forced proximity, or maybe it was the fact that Victoria finally had to confront her own flaws. One afternoon, when Ethan was at school and William at work, Victoria came to Grace's room with 2 cups of tea. She sat in the chair beside the bed, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. Then suddenly Victoria started to speak. She talked about her own childhood, about how she had grown up in a wealthy but emotionally cold family, about how she never learned to express affection because she never received affection, about how her own marriage was more of a convenience arrangement than a love relationship. Grace listened to everything in silence, seeing Victoria in a completely new way. Not as the cold, hostile woman who had tried to destroy her reputation, but as a wounded person who had never learned to deal with her own emotions. Victoria confessed that she was jealous of Grace, jealous of the ease with which she connected with Ethan, of the authenticity she had. She said she always knew she was failing as a mother, but didn't know how to fix it. She said she was afraid it was already too late, that Ethan already hated her. Grace, moved by Victoria's vulnerability, took her hand and squeezed it. "It's never too late," Grace said gently. "Ethan doesn't hate you. He just wants to be loved. And you can do that. You just need to try." Victoria cried then, silent tears streaming down her face. Grace let her cry, maintaining the grip on her hand, offering comfort without judgment. It was a healing moment for both, a bridge being built between 2 worlds that seemed impossible to unite. When Victoria finally calmed down, she wiped her tears and smiled weakly. "Thank you. For everything. For saving my son. For forcing my family to confront their flaws. For showing me how I can be better. I didn't do any of that intentionally. I know. But you did it anyway." That conversation marked a turning point in the relationship between Grace and Victoria. They didn't become best friends overnight, but there was a mutual understanding now, a respect that hadn't existed before. Victoria began seeking advice from Grace on how to better connect with Ethan, and Grace gave it gently, never judging, always encouraging. She saw Victoria really trying, really changing, and that filled her heart with hope. Maybe that family could heal. Maybe all of them could find what they were looking for. 2 weeks later, when Grace was fully recovered, she was supposed to have returned to her home, but no one seemed to want her to leave. Ethan begged her to stay. William suggested she could stay permanently, helping with Ethan and having a safe space to live. Victoria surprisingly supported the idea, but Grace refused. She explained that, as much as she appreciated the offer, she needed her independence. She needed her own space. She couldn't live there permanently without feeling like she was losing her identity, her autonomy. She promised to continue the weekly dinners, to keep being part of Ethan's life, but she needed her own home to return to at the end of the day. The family understood, respecting her decision even though they were disappointed. But before Grace left, William called her for a private conversation in his office. He offered her a job, not as a housekeeper, but as coordinator of a project he was planning. A community center in her neighborhood. It would be a place where people from the community could access resources, education, support. And Grace, with her connection to the community and her generous heart, would be perfect to coordinate. Grace was stunned by the offer. It was a real job, with a decent salary, benefits, something that would completely change her life. She asked why he was doing this, and William was honest. He said it was partly gratitude for what she had done for his family, but also because he recognized her talent for connecting people, for caring for others. He said it would be a waste not to use that talent more widely. Grace, with tears in her eyes, accepted. It was the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one she had never imagined possible. The community center took months to build and equip. During this time, Grace worked with William, planning every detail, deciding which services to offer, how to structure the operations. She discovered she had a natural talent for organization and management, skills she had never had the opportunity to develop before. Victoria also got involved, initially hesitant, but eventually finding her own role. She started teaching cooking classes at the center, something she had never done before but discovered she loved. It was a way to connect with people outside her privileged social circle, to do something meaningful. And to her surprise, she was good at it. The people in the neighborhood initially looked at her with suspicion, seeing her as just another socialite wanting to feel better about herself. But Victoria persisted and eventually earned their respect through her hard work and genuine dedication. Ethan also got involved, helping with tutoring classes for younger children. He discovered he loved teaching, loved seeing other children understand concepts he explained. It was a passion he had never discovered before, and that now flourished. The Thompson family was transforming, not just in their internal dynamics, but also in how they related to the world around them. They were learning that there was more to life than luxury and status, that true fulfillment came from making a difference in others' lives. But not everything was smooth. There was resistance from some neighborhood residents who distrusted the wealthy family's motives. There were logistical and financial challenges. There were moments when everyone questioned if they were doing the right thing. One of the biggest challenges came when a group of neighborhood youths started vandalizing the center before it even opened. They saw it as gentrification, as rich people trying to clean up the neighborhood and eventually push them out. Grace was devastated when she saw the broken windows and graffiti-covered walls. All that work, all that dream, seemed to be crumbling before it even began. But then something unexpected happened. Mrs. Constance, the neighbor who had cared for Benjamin on that fateful day years ago, organized a community meeting. Mrs. Constance still carried guilt about Benjamin's accident, even though Grace had never blamed her. She saw the community center as a way to honor the boy's memory, to transform that tragedy into something positive. At the meeting, she spoke passionately about Grace, about who she was, about her story. She explained that the center was not an attempt at gentrification, but rather a gift to the community, envisioned and managed by someone who lived there, who understood their struggles. She asked them to give the center a chance, to at least wait and see what it could offer before judging. Her words touched many hearts. The neighborhood people knew Grace, they respected her, and if she was behind that project, then maybe it was worth giving it a chance. The acts of vandalism stopped, and eventually the very youths who had spray-painted the walls returned to help clean and repaint them. It was a moment of reconciliation, of the community coming together for a common purpose. When the center finally opened, it was a celebration that involved the entire neighborhood. Hundreds of people showed up, curious, hopeful, skeptical. William gave a speech, thanking the community for the opportunity to be part of it, emphasizing that the center belonged to them, not to him. Victoria, nervous but determined, presented her schedule of cooking classes. Ethan demonstrated what the tutoring sessions would be like. But it was Grace's speech that truly touched hearts. She spoke about loss, about pain, about how she had spent years just surviving, not living. She talked about how finding Ethan on that road had changed her life, had given her a new purpose. She spoke about how that center was a way to honor Benjamin's memory, to transform her pain into something that could help others. There wasn't a dry eye when she finished. In the following months, the community center became the heart of the neighborhood. It offered literacy classes for adults, tutoring for children, professional skills workshops, mental health programs, and much more. Grace worked tirelessly, but now she wasn't alone. She had a team, she had support, she had resources, and more importantly, she had a renewed purpose. She felt that she had finally found her place in the world, a way to turn her pain into something meaningful. Victoria and Ethan were regular volunteers, and slowly the community came to accept them not as wealthy outsiders, but as genuine members who cared. William, although he couldn't be present as often due to work, made sure to show up at least once a week, talking with participants, understanding their needs, adjusting financial support as necessary. The transformation in Ethan was the most remarkable. The boy who had run away from home feeling invisible and unloved was now a confident young man who knew he was valued. His relationship with his parents had improved dramatically. William had learned to make time for his son, to be present not just physically but emotionally. Victoria had worked on her own issues through therapy and could now express affection more naturally. They weren't a perfect family, far from it, but they were a real, honest family who loved each other despite all imperfections. And Grace, who had started as just a stranger who helped an injured boy, was now an integral part of that family, not as a replacement for anyone, but as a unique and valued presence. 1 year after the center opened, during one of the weekly team meetings, Grace received news that left her in shock. A national foundation that supported community projects had heard about their work and wanted to make a substantial donation. But it wasn't just money. They wanted to use the center's model as an example to create similar centers in other communities. They wanted Grace to be a national consultant, helping to replicate the success they had achieved. It was an unbelievable opportunity, but also a frightening one. It would mean travel, greater responsibilities, being in the spotlight in a way Grace had never experienced before. She needed time to think, to process what that would mean for her life. That evening, Grace went to have dinner at the Thompsons' house as she did every week. She shared the news with the family, and the reactions were mixed. Ethan was excited but also worried, asking if this meant she would have to travel a lot. William was proud, encouraging her to accept, saying she deserved that recognition. Victoria was quiet initially, and when she finally spoke, her words surprised everyone. She said she would understand if Grace accepted, but that she would miss her terribly. That at some point during that year, Grace had become more than just Ethan's friend. She had become Victoria's friend too, perhaps even more than that. She had become family. Victoria's words, spoken with difficulty but with evident sincerity, touched Grace deeply. She had never expected that the woman who had once hated her and tried to destroy her could become so important to her. But it was true. Somewhere during that year of shared challenges and growth, they had developed a real bond. It took Grace 2 weeks to make her decision. During that time, she spoke with many people, weighed the pros and cons, prayed for guidance. In the end, she decided to accept the consultant position, but with one condition. She would remain based in her city. She would continue managing the local center. The travel would be limited to a few times a month, and she would have control over her own schedule. The foundation agreed, recognizing that it was important for Grace to maintain her roots, her connection to the community that had inspired the entire project. When Grace communicated her decision to the Thompson family, the joy was palpable. Ethan hugged her so tightly he almost knocked her over. William shook her hand warmly, his eyes shining with pride. And Victoria, to everyone's surprise, also hugged her, a genuine and warm embrace that symbolized how much their relationship had evolved. In the following months, Grace's life became busier than ever. She traveled to other cities, helping to establish new community centers, training coordinators, sharing her experiences and lessons learned. It was exhausting, but also deeply rewarding. She was making a difference not only in her own community, but in communities across the country. Her work was recognized in newspapers and magazines, and she found herself giving interviews, something that made her extremely uncomfortable at first. But she persisted, understanding that the media attention meant more resources and support for the work she loved. During one of these trips, Grace met a man named Anthony. He was the coordinator of another community center in a neighboring city, and they connected instantly through their shared work. Anthony was a widower, having lost his wife a few years before, and he understood Grace's pain in a way few others could. They began corresponding regularly, initially just about work, but eventually about other matters too. Ethan was the first to notice there was something different about Grace. She smiled more when she mentioned Anthony, spoke about him with a special fondness. The boy, now 12 and much more observant, made teasing remarks that made Grace blush. Victoria also noticed, and in one of their private conversations, she encouraged Grace to explore that relationship. She said Grace deserved to be happy, deserved to have someone in her life who valued her. She said that Benjamin would want her to move on, to be happy. Those words, coming from a Victoria who had changed so much, meant a great deal to Grace. She began to allow herself to feel something for Anthony, to open her heart to the possibility of love again. It was frightening after so many years alone, but it was also exciting. She felt alive in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. 6 months after meeting Anthony, he paid a visit to Grace's town. He wanted to see the center that had inspired the entire movement. He wanted to better understand her work. But secretly, he also wanted to spend time with Grace, to get to know her better outside of the professional context. William and Victoria insisted on meeting him, organizing a dinner at the mansion. It was an interesting evening, with William playing the protective father role, even though he wasn't a blood relative, asking tough questions about Anthony's intentions. Victoria watched everything with a discreet smile, seeing how Grace became nervous but happy with Anthony's attention. Ethan, always direct, simply asked Anthony if he liked Grace. When Anthony, after a moment of surprise, honestly answered yes, Ethan nodded approvingly and said he had his approval, but if he hurt Grace, he'd have to answer to him. Everyone laughed, but there was genuine love and protection behind the boys' words. The relationship between Grace and Anthony developed slowly but steadily. They weren't in a hurry, both understanding that building something lasting took time. He visited her whenever he could, and she visited him too. They worked together on projects, supported each other through challenges, celebrated successes together. It was a relationship based on mutual respect, shared understanding, and an affection that grew with each passing day. Grace sometimes felt guilty, as if she were betraying Benjamin's memory by being happy, but then she would look at the photo of her son in her home and feel, deep in her heart, that he would be happy for her, that he would want her to live fully, not just survive. 2 years after that fateful day on the road when Grace found Ethan, the lives of everyone involved had changed in ways none of them could have predicted. Ethan was now 12 years old, an articulate and empathetic young man who knew the value of kindness because he had experienced it firsthand. He still had challenges, still had difficult moments, but he had a solid foundation of love and support. He knew he was valued by his parents, by Grace, by an entire community he had helped build. William had changed his perspective on what success meant. He still worked hard, was still successful in business, but now he also prioritized time with family. He had learned that monetary wealth meant little without emotional wealth. He and Victoria had even started couples therapy, working to build a more genuine relationship. Victoria had traveled the longest path of transformation. The woman who had been hostile and insecure was now a more self-assured, compassionate person. She still had moments of doubt, still struggled with old habits, but she was genuinely trying to be better. Her work at the community center had given her a purpose she never knew she needed. She had made real friendships, genuine connections with people who valued who she was, not how much money she had, and her relationship with Ethan had transformed. They still had challenges, still had moments of misunderstanding, but there was also love, and that made all the difference. And Grace, the woman who had started that journey as a poor cleaning woman carrying an injured boy, was now a respected figure in her community and beyond. She had meaningful work, a loving relationship, an extended family that loved her. She had transformed her pain into purpose, her loss into legacy. But the story doesn't end here because life rarely has definitive endings. One day, 3 years after that encounter on the road, Grace received a phone call that would change everything again. It was from her ex-husband, the man who had abandoned her after the loss of Benjamin. He was in a terminal state, with only a few months to live, and wanted to see her. He wanted to apologize for the years of abandonment and guilt he had placed upon her. Grace was stunned. She hadn't thought about that man in years. She had closed that chapter of her life. But now he was coming back, bringing with him painful memories and unresolved issues. She didn't know what to do, whether she should go, whether she should forgive him. She talked to Anthony, who supported her whatever her decision. She talked to Victoria, who encouraged her to do what she felt was right for her own heart. She talked to Ethan, who, with his surprising wisdom for a 14-year-old boy, said that forgiveness was more for the one who forgives than for the one who is forgiven. In the end, Grace decided to visit her ex-husband. She went to the hospital where he was admitted, her heart heavy but determined. When she entered the room and saw the man she had once loved so reduced by illness, she felt compassion mixed with sadness for all that could have been and wasn't. They talked for hours. He asked for forgiveness for abandoning her at the moment she needed him most, for blaming her for the loss of Benjamin when both were just living their lives the best way they knew how. He told how he had regretted all those years, how he had thought about coming back so many times, but was too proud to admit he was wrong. Grace listened to everything, tears streaming silently down her face. And when he finished, she did something she didn't even expect herself. She took his hand and said she forgave him. She said that holding a grudge had been a burden she carried for too long, and that it was time to let it go. Forgiveness didn't erase the pain, didn't undo the years of loneliness and struggle, but it brought a peace that Grace didn't know she needed. When she left the hospital that day, she felt lighter than she had in years. It was as if a chain she didn't even know she was carrying had finally been broken. She went home and cried, not from sadness but from relief. She cried for everything she had lost, but also for everything she had gained. She cried for the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. 3 months later, her ex-husband passed away. Grace attended the funeral, not as a widow but as someone who had once known and loved him. She made peace with that part of her life and then let it go. It was the closure she didn't know she needed. Life went on, with its joys and challenges. The community center thrived, touching hundreds of lives. Other centers were opened in different cities, each adapted to the needs of its community, but all based on the model that Grace had helped create. She received awards and recognition, but what she valued most were the letters and messages from people whose lives had been changed by her work. Ethan grew up and became a remarkable young man, planning to study social work in college, inspired by Grace's work. His relationship with his parents continued to strengthen, built on a foundation of honest communication and genuine love. William and Victoria renewed their marriage vows in a simple ceremony at the community center, symbolizing their renewed commitment not only to each other, but also to making a difference in the world. Grace and Anthony married in a small, intimate ceremony, with Ethan as the best man and Victoria as the maid of honor. It was a moment of pure happiness, two wounded hearts finding healing in each other. They didn't plan to have children, both already at an age where that was unlikely, but they found purpose in being parental figures to the hundreds of children who passed through the community centers. Her modest home, now comfortable thanks to Grace's hard work, was always filled with young people visiting, seeking advice, or simply wanting to be in the presence of someone who genuinely cared. 5 years after that day on the road, during a community center anniversary celebration, Ethan, now 17 and preparing to enter university, gave a moving speech. He spoke about how a random encounter on the road had changed not only his life, but the lives of countless others. He thanked Grace for stopping when she could have driven on, for caring when she didn't have to, for loving when she had no obligation. He spoke about how she had saved not only his life that day, but his soul over the following years. There wasn't a dry eye in the auditorium when he finished. Grace was seated in the front row, Anthony on one side and Victoria on the other, tears streaming freely down her face. William, sitting behind them, had his hand on Victoria's shoulder, both clearly moved. When Ethan stepped off the stage, he went straight to Grace and hugged her, whispering a "thank you" that summed up years of gratitude, love, and respect. That moment, that hug, was the confirmation of everything Grace had worked for, of all the sacrifices she had made. It was worth it. Everything had been worth it. Later that evening, when the celebration ended and everyone went home, Grace stayed alone for a moment in the center, walking through the empty halls. She looked at the photos on the walls, showing the faces of people whose lives had been touched. She thought of Benjamin, how proud he would be of the work she was doing in his memory. She thought of the injured boy she had found on the road, now a young man ready to change the world. She thought of Victoria, who had transformed from an enemy into a friend and almost a sister. She thought of William, who had learned that being a father was more than just providing financially. And she thought of Anthony, the unexpected love she had found when she was no longer looking. Grace's life had been full of pain and loss, but it had also been full of joy and victories. She had learned that kindness is never wasted, that a single act of compassion could have effects that spread like ripples in a pond. She had learned that family wasn't just about blood, but also about choice, that the strongest bonds were those forged through shared experiences and unconditional love. She had learned that it's never too late to start over, to find purpose, to be happy. And most importantly, she had learned that pain could be transformed into something beautiful, that loss could give rise to a legacy, that the end of one chapter is always the beginning of another. As she locked up the center that night and walked toward her home where Anthony was waiting, Grace felt grateful. Grateful for everything she had lived through, for all the people who had crossed her path, for all the lessons she had learned. She wouldn't change a thing because every pain, every challenge, every difficult moment had shaped her into the person she was now, and she was proud of that person. She was at peace. End of story. And you, what did you think of this story of transformation and overcoming? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what touched your heart the most in this journey. Do you think Grace made the right choice by forgiving? Leave your honest opinion. We love reading every comment. Thank you so much for your company up to this point. Don't forget to leave your like on this video, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories like this one.